debates about the use of words often come from inappropriate forms of pride. They produce time-wasting questions for fruitless research into trivialities. And this can often be when truth is no longer the priority, but only one's ego. A prime example of this is how some people have been needlessly arguing over the terms micro and macroevolution. When you get to the motivation behind such arguments, it's not about seeking truth, but propping up a person's arrogance, when worldviews are smuggled into the science room, and then dogmatically imposed upon everybody. So, some people, out there, are claiming that the term microevolution is a creationist terminology, perhaps in the hope that they might forbid scientists from using the word. Well then, is microevolution only a creationist term? No. Creationists did not invent that term. In fact, some creationists have expressed dislike toward the term. They certainly use it sometimes, but they did not invent it. On the other hand, evolutionists sometimes also object to the use of this word, because it calls attention to certain aspects of evolutionary theory that they don't like to be called attention to. Well, tough. Science doesn't really care what any of us like or don't like. It is what it is. Micro means small, macro means big. Microevolution means small changes over a short time from one generation to the next. Macroevolution means big changes over a long time through many generations. So, those are the concepts, and their meanings, big evolution and small evolution, which at first seems arbitrary, whether you like them or not, it's that simple. So, why did scientists see the need to split evolution into small and big? There must have been a good reason for it, otherwise, why would they have bothered? Is the line between micro and macro, in Darwinian evolution theory, really only arbitrary? Or is it a proper distinction, separating the proven facts from speculation, and from unsubstantiated beliefs? That is what scientists are supposed to do, right? So where has the ridiculous controversy about these words come from? Well, in order to see how silly such arguments are, it helps to know the early origin of the word. The first known use of the term microevolution was by American botanist Robert Greenleaf Leavitt in 1909. He used it in the journal Botanical Gazette to discuss the mystery of how formless things give rise to form. So the word microevolution originated as a naturalistic terminology. It was distinguished from speculating and questioning what such observable changes were ultimately capable of. It was not a creationist invention. Not that it should matter, one way or the other. Then there is the later usage in modern context of the word, to consider. Russian zoologist Yuri Filipchenko independently introduced the terms microevolution and macroevolution in his 1927 German language work, Variabilität und Variation. The term microevolution was coined along with macroevolution, to describe the concepts of evolution at different scales. He used them to differentiate between evolutionary changes within a species and those occurring over long periods, possibly resulting in major evolutionary changes large enough to form new species. So, it is also being used here to support a naturalistic hypothesis. Other than that, it had nothing intentionally controversial to say at the time. The concept of micro and macroevolution gained wide traction in the English-speaking world through the work of geneticist Theodosius Dobzhansky, in his influential 1937 book, Genetics and the Origin of Species. Historically, Leavitt's early use of the word marked the initial coinage of the term, while Filipchenko established the framework for understanding evolution theory at two distinct scales, one scale which is fairly well known, and the other far less known, therefore not entirely arbitrary, a distinction that was then popularized by Dobzhansky. So, Macroevolution is not solely a creationist term. It was first used by evolutionary scientists and therefore is a recognized concept describing evolutionary changes within a species. While creationists do use the term to differentiate observable variations within kinds from specific types of hypothetical larger naturalistic evolutionary changes that they reject, there are many scientists who don't reject such ideas, but teach microevolution as the fundamental process of Darwinian evolution that, over long periods, accumulates into hypothetically macroevolution, where they believe that the organized complexity of organisms might sometimes increase over generations. Scientific definition: microevolution refers to changes in allele frequencies within a population from one generation to the next. It is a well-documented and observed phenomenon, encompassing changes like the development of antibiotic resistance in bacteria, or the evolution of different breeds of dogs through artificial selection. Creationists use the term microevolution as a way to reject larger evolution. So creationists often use microevolution as a concession to observable changes, but they reject macroevolution, not so much the large-scale changes believed to be leading to new species, but more specifically the hypothetical naturalistic increases in organized complexity, as impossible. To maintain their view of kinds, which in this case is a biblical term, creationists believe that microevolution explains variations within specific kinds of organisms, but they argue that it is incapable of creating entirely new kinds, according to an interpretation of the biblical kinds as stated in the book of Genesis. And this is why some creationists dislike the word microevolution, because they feel that macroevolution is modern mythology. So the word microevolution is therefore an unnecessary distinction, totally superfluous. On the other hand, many other creationists do use the word microevolution rigorously to describe what they believe as the limit of natural evolution within the scope of Darwinian theory. To do this, they cite the current observational limits within scientific investigation, which within the field of biology includes recombination of already existing genes, and sometimes the progressive damage and loss of genes from one generation to the next. This damage is also technically known as germline mutations. These are experimentally demonstrable. Whereas evolutionists generally tend to claim that there is no such limit to evolution, and therefore many of them, beyond the current empirical limits of science, believe that natural selection of genetic mutations can produce new and increasing functional complexity over multiple generations, a hypothetical sequence of events that has not yet been observed. So, there remain less rigorous, pseudo-scientific people who contend that the microevolution concept is arbitrary, whereas those who are more seriously scientific say that it does have a valid empirical distinction, that is, between what has been observed, and ideas that have not been observed, nor demonstrated experimentally. So, although the varying levels of complexity can be observed, their cause remains largely within the realm of speculation. Therefore, in this way, the term microevolution is not arbitrary, because increasing functional complexity over generations has not been demonstrated experimentally. To those who have not been properly informed about this subject, if the person describing it is being lazy, and not specifying its empirical significance, distinguishing between an unobservable, undocumented, hypothetical increase of organized complexity, essential to the macroevolution hypothesis, and the observable evolution, microevolution, then, when not taking such definitive observational distinctions into account, they have sometimes claimed that this dichotomy is not real but false. However, by doing so, they have manifested their own sloppy lack of appropriate skepticism to the scientific community, because there actually is a dichotomy, the observable and the unobservable, and of course it can be deduced if first the problem is more accurately stated, that is, scientifically, correctly to begin with, observationally, fundamentally distinguished for the sake of scientific rigor. So a good scientist would not be trying to make the case that macroevolution is possible merely as a result of only the scientifically proven types of microevolutionary changes, accumulating over successive generations. We would require more than just that, in order to allow the possibility of natural increases of organized complexity over sequential generations. Speciation, according to some definitions, certainly does happen, but that is not what is being questioned here. We are talking more specifically about what has not been scientifically demonstrated, about organized complexity within populations somehow increasing over generations, and it would require an incredibly unlikely happy accident of increased functional complexity, actually a vast plethora of such accidents, especially in the genetic code, and its associated cascading integrated mechanisms, for nature to then select, so that an uphill direction of evolution could ever be, even remotely, possible, if at all. Only then might someone, who is truly scientifically minded, dare to imagine it ever to be a substitute for an intelligent designer, or creator God, if this naturalistic type of personal incredulity is to be allowed as a hypothesis. But the claim that Darwinian processes are capable of increasing biological complexity, this naturalistic gap in evolution theory, to explain the variety of organized complexity that we see, has not been filled scientifically. It has never been experimentally proven, the same way atheists are skeptical about the concept of supernatural special creation and therefore criticize it. So, people from both opposing worldview hypotheses level the same criticism at each other, and that is fair enough. But this whole conjecture, to begin with, is flawed, because it excluded the more fundamental question of whether such accumulated changes are either ultimately detrimental and destructive, or creative of more functional complexity, by the Darwinian evolutionary processes, over vast periods of time. So there is a somewhat irrelevant argument between two opposing belief systems going on here, because, at this stage, they should only be represented as hypotheses, and nothing more within the arena of science. And so this brings us to the scientific versus worldview distinction. Many scientists believe that microevolution is the basic mechanism that sometimes might drive evolution uphill, that is, hypothetically, into macroevolution, which is the presupposition that the larger scale accumulation of these small changes over vast stretches of time with successive generations somehow added up to extra functional complexity, available for nature to perhaps then select and filter out for future generations to replicate and perpetuate. Such hypothesized anomalous uphill changes would be at the expense of the much observable death, the vastly more disorder and destruction that we do know to be true, along the way, which some say more than offsets and rebalances the scales of entropy to fulfill the requirements of the second law of thermodynamics, but this idea is speculation. This is the hypothetical Darwinian tree of life, that many atheists would like to believe might replace belief in a creator God, within the field of biology. This is why worldviews should be kept out of the science room, unless they can be presented as hypotheses, on the proviso that they are, at least in principle, experimentally falsifiable, and in such a way can be tested. Worldviews notwithstanding, this is not a straw-man argument about whether natural selection happens, because people on both sides of the argument know that it does. But it's a proper scientific question about whether such increases in functional complexity are even possible at all, so that nature might then have a chance at selecting such. But what is there, really, for nature to select? Well, the creationist distinction attempts to create a boundary at the level of family or kind, actually not a very arbitrary line at all, but quite well deduced, which, some biologists nonetheless claim is completely arbitrary, and some say that it does not align with scientific understanding of evolutionary processes. However, although there appears to be some experimental and observational evidence that agrees with these Darwinistic claims, in this particular instance these chosen agreeable phenomena cannot be experimentally distinguished from only supporting confirmation bias, and the only real experimental and empirical distinction that can be scientifically established, in any real sense, is downhill evolution, in cases where a definite direction to evolution can actually be measured and observed, happening at all. That is, within human timescales. Physicists, mathematicians, and information theorists are not surprised by these findings. It's exactly what their theories had predicted at a more fundamental level. So, micro and macroevolution are largely recognized empirically distinctive concepts by the scientific establishment, especially in the field of biology, whether you believe them to be arbitrary or not. These terms, microevolution and macroevolution, in more recent times, have been able to represent two very important distinctions for science. Firstly, they distinguish between what concurs with some theoretical predictions and that which doesn't. Secondly, they clearly distinguish between the unobservable, not proven, uphill, versus the observable, experimentally proven, downhill, evolution, that is, between the hypothesized naturalistic increases in organized complexity that no one has yet observed happening, and the actually measured and observed changes over time, which include, not only variation, due to the recombination of already existing genes, but also the degeneration, and genetic information loss. These can be observed over successive generations. And it has often been observed within isolated, and inbred, populations. Yes, this has been documented many times, germline mutations. Nevertheless, just like many evolutionists, the famous atheist and evolutionary scientist, Richard Dawkins, has contended, his belief, that life can, on rare occasions, naturally evolve in the direction of increasing organized complexity, by natural selection. He uses a very loose analogy, climbing up the gentle slopes around the back of Mount Improbable. Other evolutionary scientists have come up with novel ways of trying to provide a supporting explanation. The famous thought experiment, Maxwell's demon, and natural selection, are sometimes compared to each other, because both involve a selective agent that sorts information to create order, seemingly against the second law of thermodynamics. It is claimed that natural selection acts as a demon that sorts advantageous traits from random mutations, somehow increasing the organism's complexity and fitness over time. They say that the comparison helps explain how living systems can maintain order, with evolution supposedly being a process that uses energy to reduce entropy locally, by selecting information from the environment. However, it was realized about 100 years later that it required an offset of information, selective memory, and, let's face it, this hypothetical demon seems analogous for, not a random undirected process, but an intelligent agent, intelligent selection, which is a thorn in the side of materialism. And whether you view natural selection as random or not, genetic mutations are most certainly random. Nevertheless, the idea might seem to have a ring of plausibility to it. Of course, by far the biggest problem for this is scientific. Because such hypothetical reversal events of increasing order are postulated to be extremely rare, amid the vast sea of observable degenerative processes, this idea has not yet been experimentally falsified. In fact, no one can say if it ever can be. But, as already discussed, because such ideas have neither been definitively demonstrated, by the real-time experimental and observational methodology with documentation, at this point they remain speculative at best, regardless of how dogmatically someone wants to interpret all the existing evidence. It is often the case that when someone objects to how someone else is using a word, such as microevolution, or macroevolution, This might be an indication that they are trying to protect a paradigm or an ideology from transparent critical analysis. For instance, meanings of word definitions are often attacked in philosophical debates, but certain scientists have chosen to avoid becoming overly embroiled in the meaning of words, and the fruitless arguments that result from it, but instead cut to a more critical scientific question about the observed processes of Darwinian evolution. Instead of engaging in the straw man arguments about whether evolution happens, they are asking the more honest fundamental question about the actual, proven, direction of the observable processes of Darwinian evolution, which is often referred to as macroevolution. For instance, plant geneticist John Sanford puts forth the contention of genetic entropy, and argues that Darwinian evolution is a downhill process that will ultimately result in gene death. He has argued that except for the more lethal mutations, most genetic mutations are not naturally selectable, and also degenerative, and that includes ones that seem beneficial on the surface. Biologist Michael Behe also has argued, for a long time, that life is de-evolving, because Darwinian processes, which involve genetic mutations, are destructive to life during reproduction, even the beneficial ones. He also has identified another serious problem with the macroevolution belief system. There are many types of biological systems that are irreducibly complex, in that they possess irreducible functionality, and so, because Darwinian evolution is a process that doesn't have a future goal in mind, it cannot, gradually, ever, evolve uphill. Not toward this type of greater functional complexity. Not via the well-known mutation selection mechanism, and this is most certainly an empirical argument. Some evolutionists might want to disagree, however both those men, Behe and Sanford, were previously evolutionists. So why then did they change their mind? Both sides, evolutionism and creationism, of course interpret the fossil record in their own way, but the biggest takeaway from these conjectures, in scientific terms, is that those phenomena, biological deterioration and genetic entropy, have been observed and documented, so they stand up to scientific requirements. And, ironically, even evolutionists speculate about the possibility of junk DNA, but it seems that it would be the product of decay. The same cannot be said for the claim of uphill evolution, an idea essential for macroevolution. It does not measure up to the same high standards of empirical evidence in the laboratory. If these conjectures are ultimately true, then this of course implies that life began in a more complex and more organized state, what appears to align with the second law of thermodynamics. So, atheists, some of whom express hate toward intelligent design theory, are ideologically committed to teaching people that believing in hypothetically increasing organized complexity from a simpler state can replace belief in God. Some of them who have not properly thought it through, want to get into pointless arguments over words, like microevolution and macroevolution. Some such people not only waste people's time, by disputing their meanings, but also, they dispute whether, these words, can even be used, at all, even though the empirical necessity to use them is obvious. Why is this so? These words, micro and macroevolution, are not as arbitrary as what some Darwinists might want to religiously impose on everyone. Atheism is manifestly a religion. This entire conjecture results from the ad hominem argumentation of materialist atheism, and sometimes also from creationism, but only by a limited number of not-so-clever people, on either side. Because, even if some hypotheses might turn out in the end to be mythology, we still need words to question and distinguish them that way, if we are truly truth-seekers. But in a lot of cases, is it perhaps a feeble attempt to protect materialist evolutionism from such criticism, because such words, that ironically were first invented by evolutionists, now tend to scientifically focus attention to serious, logical and empirical contradictions within the evolutionist ideology. Whatever the case, no one from the materialist worldview camp has successfully refuted these disturbing creationist conjectures about micro and macroevolution, especially their critically important contention that the direction of Darwinian evolution is downhill, toward disorganization and gene death. This is a genuine scientific question. Attempts by evolutionists to scientifically refute this particular conjecture have been unsuccessful. And, no matter from whom such arguments may come, such rigor is welcome and healthy for science. It comes as no surprise that some people in the atheist and evolutionist community find these conjectures annoying, what some misinformed people consider to be creationist arguments, when creationism in this case is irrelevant, because actually they are scientifically formulated. They are legitimate questions for research. But of course, facts don't care about anyone's feelings, nor from where such arguments originate. As far as science goes, we observe what we observe, that's all there is to it, in the end. The facts don't really care whether you believe in God or not. But this of course doesn't in itself mean that you shouldn't care. Nevertheless, reality will turn out to be whatever it is, and all true scientists know this. Whether you believe in a creator God or not, whether you think natural evolution created it all or not, it has to be said that such extremists who dogmatically tout aspects of evolution theory as though it were an unquestionable religious doctrine, and then raise objections to the well-known terms micro and macroevolution, are outliers, because generally speaking, these scientifically rigorous terminologies are taken very seriously. So, outside the science room, it can be understood why a significant portion of the scientific community still believes in the existence of God. Certainly there are people within both the evolutionist and creationist communities who dislike those terminologies for their own personal reasons, and perhaps it's the militant atheists who have the biggest problem with it. Such worldview stubbornness is perhaps derived from those people who are cherry-picking the confirmation bias out of the data while ignoring the rest of it, clinging to their ideological comfort zone, who want to, not merely blur but, pretentiously eradicate the line between micro and macroevolution, in the hope they can avoid a proper and honest scientific analysis of it, to establish whether there is such a limit to evolution, which is often labeled microevolution. And perhaps some people are afraid that there is. Perhaps it's because they would then have to consider the possibility of God's existence, and the responsibilities that it would entail. But this has nothing to do with science. Or perhaps they value the acceptance of their peers, more than uncovering the truth, which is another potential science stopper. Do such ones really have such weak character? Do they really want to get to the bottom of this, like true scientists? Or not? Don't they want to search for the truth, uncover the facts, and have the question properly answered? Is there some type of possible discovery that might eventuate from all of this that they are afraid of? Is the actual evidence now revealing the overwhelming likelihood of God's existence? This entire fiasco demonstrates the folly of bringing religiosity into the science room. If you are a scientist, you should understand that whether it is materialist evolutionism or creationism, even if it is a question about ultimate origins, leave your worldview at the door, and collect it, if you must, when you check out at the end of your working day. A worldview, to a scientist, is just a testable hypothesis that has not yet been fully proven, nor fully disproven either, and nothing more.